Welcome to AI Podcast. Today, we'll discuss the most important current affairs from the Hindu 11 June 2026 edition, with detailed analysis for UPSC aspirants. And, facing the sheer volume of global news we have today can feel, well, a bit like staring at an impenetrable wall.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly overwhelming if you just look at the headlines.
Right. But I want you to keep this in mind as we start today. The river does not cut through the rock because it is powerful. It cuts through the rock because it keeps flowing. Great achievements are rarely the result of extraordinary talent. They are the result of extraordinary persistence.
I love that. And that persistence is exactly what you need to decode the mechanics behind all these headlines. We've got a massive stack of sources today.
Yeah, we really do. We're covering everything from geopolitical flashpoints to, the redrawing of India's political map, all the way down to your actual DNA.
Right, the human genome. And what ties all this together, the core theme here is structures, like rigid global rules, physical borders, legal codes, and how we actively try to navigate or just rewrite them.
So let's start with one of those rigid global structures breaking down, because it resulted in some really tragic news hitting close to home. 2 Indian seafarers are dead, and 1 is still missing.
Yeah, this happened after U.S. forces struck a Palau-flagged oil tanker. It's called the Setabello, and it was in the Gulf of Oman.
Right, and India has officially summoned the U.S. Embassy's Deputy Chief of Mission to lodge a strong protest. But, what is the actual mechanism at play here? How does a commercial ship just end up taking military fire?
Well, the U.S. Central Command CENTCOM, they claim they disabled the ship because it was actively violating an ongoing blockade of Iranian ports.
Okay.
The allegation is that the Setabello was, attempting to transport Iranian oil. And when the crew didn't comply with CENTCOM's directions, an American aircraft fired precision munitions directly into the ship's engine room, just to cripple it.
Wow. Wait, so it's less like a high-stakes geopolitical chessboard and more like, a major international highway where local delivery drivers are suddenly getting blown up, just caught in the crossfire of a high-speed police chase.
That's actually a really good way to put it. It's an isolated strike, but it's clearly spilling over from a much, much larger conflict.
Yeah, the U.S.-Iran dynamic.
Exactly. We're seeing this rapidly escalating tit-for-tat dynamic. The U.S. recently launched airstrikes after an American military helicopter was downed over the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
And then Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps immediately retaliated. They fired drones and missiles at U.S. bases in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. So both militaries are trading heavy blows, but like you said, it's international commerce and civilian workers absorbing the collateral damage.
Yeah. And before we dig deeper into the nuclear aspect of this, I just need to make something completely clear to you, the listener. We are analyzing these reports strictly to convey the facts on the ground.
Right, and entirely impartial.
Exactly. We're absolutely not taking any sides here. We're not endorsing the viewpoints or actions of the U.S., Iran, or anyone else, just mapping out the reality.
And part of mapping that reality requires looking at the institutional fallout of all this, like the International Atomic Energy Agency.
The UN's nuclear watchdog.
Right. They just passed a major resolution against Iran. The IAEA board is demanding that Iran grant immediate inspector access and provide, comprehensive information about its nuclear material.
And what's driving that specific resolution right now?
It's the data. The IAEA data shows Iran now has a stockpile of 440.9 kilograms of uranium enriched up to 60% purity.
I always see that 60% number thrown around in the news. Why is that specific threshold the trigger for a UN resolution?
Well, it comes down to the nonlinear physics of uranium enrichment. Getting uranium from its natural state up to 60% requires just massive amounts of time, energy, centrifuge cascades. It's a huge lift.
Okay.
But once you hit 60%, the technical effort required to push it to the 90% needed for weapons-grade material is incredibly small.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a very short sprint to a nuclear weapon from there. But what's really interesting is the diplomatic breakdown of the vote itself.
How so?
Well, the U.S., the U.K., France, and Germany, they pushed the resolution forward. But Russia and China formally opposed it.
Man, that's a perfect snapshot of multipolar fragmentation. The global consensus on non-proliferation is fracturing along the exact same lines as the broader geopolitical divide.
Exactly.
And, that proxy warfare isn't just happening in the Middle East. It's happening right on India's doorstep. Let's look at the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Pakistan just carried out overnight airstrikes inside Afghanistan.
Right, specifically in Khost, Kunar, and Paktika. and that killed 26 people.
What's Pakistan's official stance on this?
Pakistan's information minister stated these were highly calibrated strikes targeting the hideouts of the Tehrik-i-Taliban, Pakistan the TTP. Islamabad refers to them as Fitna al-Khawarij. They claim the targets were key militant commanders orchestrating cross-border terror.
But the Taliban regime in Kabul is presenting a completely different reality on the ground.
They are.
Yeah, they reported that the strikes obliterated civilian homes and that the casualties were primarily women and children.
And this kind of regional violence immediately translates into diplomatic gridlock at the UN Security Council. We literally just saw Pakistan and China make a joint bid to designate two groups, the Balochistan Liberation Army, or BLA, and the Majid Brigade as international terrorist entities.
Right, and that bid was immediately vetoed and blocked by the US, France, and the UK. But wait, why would the US and its allies block the terror designation of known militant groups? Is this just about geopolitical leverage?
It is entirely about leverage. I mean, for years, China has systematically used its veto power to block the UN terror listings of Pakistan-based groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba or Jaish-e-Mohammed.
Right, which has been incredibly frustrating for India and Western nations.
Exactly. So by blocking the designation of the BLA, the US, France, and the UK are essentially returning the favor. It's a diplomatic tit for tat. International terrorism designations are basically being used as bargaining chips to punish rival geopolitical axes.
So if you're looking at these reports from the Land Ports Authority of India, you can see exactly how the Indian government is reacting to this fractured, volatile neighborhood. They are proposing 74 new land ports along the international borders.
Yeah, that's a massive physical infrastructure push.
It is. 6 are proposed along the Pakistan border, and crucially, 3 are slated for the China border at Namjia, Gunji, and Nathula. And border trade at those 3 specific points has been essentially suspended since 2020.
Right.
But help me understand the institutional mechanics here. What makes a land port different from just, a standard border crossing or a trade point?
Well, a simple trade point is largely unregulated. It's just a geographic spot where locals might exchange goods. But a land port is a massive, formalized institutional valve.
Okay, so a lot more official.
Much more. It brings customs, immigration, armed security, quarantine facilities, and heavy cargo infrastructure all under one roof. When you build a land port, you aren't just facilitating trade, you are asserting hard state control over exactly who and what enters the country. It's a defensive perimeter.
So we are pouring resources into physical walls to define the nation externally. But the internal boundaries, the lines that dictate who actually holds political power, are about to undergo an even more drastic redrawing.
You're talking about the delimitation.
Exactly. The Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, the EACPM, they have a new model for the delimitation of Lok Sabha constituencies. They're proposing expanding the House to 824 seats.
And to understand the gravity of that 824 number, we really have to look at the historical context. The proportion of Lok Sabha seats each state holds has been frozen since the 42nd Amendment in 1976.
Right, which relied on the 1971 census.
Exactly. The government instituted that freeze so that states successfully implementing national family planning policies, which were primarily the southern states, wouldn't be punished by losing political representation to northern states whose populations were exploding.
And unfreezing it now essentially realizes that exact fear. Because according to the EACPM's model, the southern states' aggregate share of seats would drop to 23.6%, while the share of 6 highly populous northern and western states would surge to 45.2%.
The raw numbers are contentious enough, but the EACPM's proposed methodology for drawing the actual constituency lines is even more provocative.
How so?
Well, instead of just dividing the map uniformly based on population size, they are advocating for a targeted split. They want the Delimitation Commission to use the joint demographic and linguistic profile of an area as the primary criterion for drawing the boundaries.
Wait, splitting constituencies based on specific demographics and lineage data? How is that not just state-sanctioned gerrymandering?
Well,
Like, if you intentionally bundle certain linguistic or social groups together to maximize voter turnout, aren't you engineering the political outcome?
that is the core criticism of this model, absolutely. The EACPM analyzed data from 2009 to 2024 and found a strong statistical relationship between voter turnout and factors like linguistic diversity or the share of SC/ST populations.
No.
Their argument is that by grouping cohesive socioeconomic units together, you create more representative governance. But critics argue, exactly as you pointed out, that engineering lines based on social identity is a highly dangerous tool. It could easily be weaponized to marginalize specific voting blocs.
So we're talking about engineering a political architecture to create cohesion. But let's pivot to the economic architecture. The government frequently points to foreign direct investment, FDI, as proof of a cohesive, booming economy.
Right.
But looking at the source material, the headline numbers seem to be creating a massive illusion.
Yeah, the gross FDI inflows look fantastic on paper. The chief economic advisor highlights them constantly, but when you look at the net FDI, the entire narrative just collapses.
This falls apart.
Exactly. From a peak of $44 billion in the 2020-21 financial year, India's net FDI crashed to below $1 billion in 2024-25.
Below $1 billion. Which brings us back to the hook of today's deep dive. My notes show that for every single dollar of fresh foreign investment coming in right now, roughly $1.50 is flowing out of the country.
Yeah, it's wild.
How does an economy bleed that much capital while still reporting high gross investment?
It fundamentally comes down to the business models of the investors. We traditionally think of FDI as real FDI, or RFTI.
Like a multinational corporation building a manufacturing plant.
Exactly, bringing in new technology, creating long-term jobs. But RFDI currently accounts for only 10.6% of total effective inflows. The vast majority of the capital entering India is driven by financial investors, private equity funds, venture capital, and sovereign wealth funds.
And their mandate isn't to build infrastructure, it's to generate returns for their limited partners.
Right.
They buy stakes in existing companies, wait 5 to 7 years, and then cash out.
And that is the exact mechanism driving the outflow. The massive drain we are seeing is capital repatriation and disinvestment by these financial players securing their profits.
Oh, I see.
On top of that, you have massive dividend remittances and intellectual property royalties leaving the country. And even worse, a significant chunk of what gets recorded as gross FDI consists of corporate accounting maneuvers.
Like what?
Like share swaps or mergers, where no actual new capital ever enters the Indian economy. So celebrating gross FDI while ignoring the net outflow is basically like a business celebrating record sales while ignoring the fact that their supply chain costs just bankrupted them.
Yeah, the economic numbers hide the ground reality. But we do see the government trying to build structural frameworks to fix some of these broader vulnerabilities.
Right.
Look at the National Disaster Management Authority, the NDMA.
Right.
They are pushing a massive new framework called Resilient India 2047, utilizing sections 35 and 37 of the Disaster Management Act.
Which represents a huge shift from reactive disaster management to proactive mitigation.
How does that work legally?
Sections 35 and 37 legally require all union ministries to develop comprehensive disaster management plans. Rather than waiting for a flood or an earthquake to request emergency funds, ministries must bake hazard-specific response frameworks directly into their initial policy and infrastructure planning.
And that philosophy of resilience is even extending to corporate infrastructure. The Ministry of Civil Aviation is applying an anti-monopoly framework to upcoming airport privatizations.
Right.
They're placing a strict cap where a single corporate bidder can only win 2 to 3 bundles, which translates to a maximum of about 5 or 6 airports out of the 11 going up for bid.
Yeah, and that is a direct reaction to the structural vulnerabilities created back in 2019. During that privatization round, the Adani Group won the bids for all 6 airports on offer.
Wow, all of them.
All of them. And from an economic resilience standpoint, allowing critical national infrastructure to consolidate into a single oligopoly creates a massive single point of failure. So the cap is designed to force market competition.
But, I have to push back on this entire concept of high-level resilience.
Sure.
You have these sweeping NDMA frameworks and aviation caps, but the everyday reality for Indian workers is still incredibly grim. People are dying in completely preventable ways.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Just recently, 9 workers died after a massive explosion involving 150 tons of molten steel at the Visakhapatnam steel plant. And down in Surat, 4 workers suffocated to death after entering a septic tank. Where is the structural resilience there?
It doesn't exist, largely because of a catastrophic failure in data reporting and basic safety management. Both of those incidents were entirely foreseeable.
Right.
The hazard of confined space entry, like a septic tank, is well documented. The mitigation requires breathing apparatuses, mechanical ventilation, and safety harnesses. Industry has known this for decades.
So why are workers still walking into them unprotected?
Because the regulatory framework, specifically the Occupational Safety, Health, and Working Conditions Code of 2020, or the OSH Code, has massive enforcement gaps.
Why is enforcement so bad?
There is a glaring disconnect between the data collected by the Labor Bureau, and the data from the Directorate General of Factory Advice Service and Labor Institutes, or DGFA-SLI. When regulatory bodies aren't capturing unified, accurate data on workplace hazards, enforcement becomes impossible. You simply cannot regulate a failure you aren't properly measuring.
It is a failure to adapt to known constraints. But where the system fails in labor safety, it is actively trying to adapt in the energy sector.
Oh, absolutely.
India has massive renewable energy goals, but acquiring the land for mega solar parks is slow, expensive, and triggers endless conflicts with the agricultural sector. So the engineering workaround is floating solar.
Which is brilliant in theory. The National Institute of Solar Energy, NS, recently assessed that India's reservoirs have the potential to host 102 gigawatts of floating solar capacity.
102 gigawatts.
Yeah. By moving the photovoltaic panels onto the water, the infrastructure becomes entirely land neutral. It just solves the acquisition bottleneck instantly.
In theory, yes. But my notes on the flagship Omkareshwar floating solar park on the Narmada River show a much messier reality.
Right, the 278 megawatt project.
Exactly. NICE field engineers are already documenting severe physical failures there. The constant movement of the water is loosening the float joints, misaligning the platforms, and causing the high-tension electric cables to just snap.
Physical reality always resists our theoretical models. The environment puts up a fight. But we see the same drive to innovate around rigid constraints in our legal system as well.
Oh, for sure.
Consider how the Supreme Court recently utilized its extraordinary powers under Article 142 of the Constitution.
This is such a fascinating case. A man was sentenced to 10 years in prison under POCSO, that's the Protection of Children from Sexual Offenses Act, for a relationship with a minor.
Right.
But as the case wound its way through the very slow judicial system, the victim and the accused grew up, married each other as adults, and had a child together.
And under the strict, literal reading of the POCSO code, the conviction and the 10-year prison sentence were legally mandated. There was no way around it.
But applying that rigid law would have destroyed an existing functional family, effectively punishing the very victim the law was designed to protect.
Exactly. And that's where Article 142 comes in. It allows the Supreme Court to bypass statutory laws to ensure complete justice in exceptional situations. The court recognized that the reality of the people involved had outgrown the strict parameters of the legal code, so they quashed the conviction.
Overriding a rigid code because the environmental reality changed. That perfectly describes the final topic in our stack today, the human genetic code.
Oh, yes.
For years, commercial DNA testing companies have sold us the narrative that our biology is just an unchangeable crystal ball.
It is a deeply entrenched myth known as biological determinism. It was heavily popularized after the discovery of the Huntington's disease mutation. But geneticists are actively dismantling this idea. Well, take the FTO gene, which stands for fat mass and obesity-associated protein. For years, the media dubbed it the obesity gene, implying that if you had the mutation, your weight was predetermined.
But the actual science shows its effect is incredibly minor.
Right. Precisely. It is almost negligible on its own. Conditions like Huntington's are monogenic. A single gene mutation guarantees the disease. But most common conditions, like obesity, diabetes, schizophrenia, they are polygenic.
Meaning multiple genes.
Right. They are the combined result of mutations across hundreds or thousands of genes, each contributing a tiny fraction of a percent to your overall risk.
And the ultimate override to that risk is epigenetics.
Yes.
This is the mechanism by which your external environment, your diet, your stress levels, your physical activity actually alters how your genes are expressed.
Yes.
You aren't changing the underlying DNA code. You are changing which parts of it the body chooses to read.
The researcher Ullis Coulter-Cesarum uses a brilliant analogy for this. Imagine the human genome as a grand piano, where every key is a different gene. If you have a faulty key, it will produce a discordant note.
Okay.
However, you don't play a piano by striking one key. By skillfully adjusting how you play the other keys, which is your epigenetic environment and lifestyle choices, you can entirely compensate for the broken key and still produce harmonious music. The gene is merely the instrument. Epigenetics is how you play it.
The gene is merely the instrument. That completely reframes how we view our own biology. And honestly, it synthesizes the massive amount of ground we've covered today.
It really does.
Whether we are looking at the rigid geopolitics of the U.S. and Iran, the strict lines of India's political map, the constraints of land acquisition, or the microscopic code of our own DNA, we are constantly dealing with structures that try to dictate the future. But the reality is always messier, and there is almost always a mechanism to override the system.
Which leaves me with a thought I hope you, the listener, will reflect on long after this deep dive ends.
Let's hear it.
If our physical environment can rewrite how our genetic code is expressed, and if shifting diplomatic alliances can override established global trade rules, how much of our individual and national future is actually written in stone, and how much is just waiting for us to actively reshape it?
That is the perfect question to end on. The rock might be hard, but the river keeps flowing. Keep that persistence flowing in your own life. Keep pushing back against the surface numbers and keep connecting the dots. Thank you for joining us on today's Deep Dives. We'll catch you next time.